The day my father was released from the hospital, my brother Daniel stood in the lobby holding a manila envelope and wearing the expression of a man who had just saved the world. He shook the doctor's hand. He clapped my father on the shoulder. He smiled at the nurses who had spent 23 days keeping our dad alive through a cardiac event that had no business leaving him standing, and he told them, in that warm, carrying voice of his, "Everything's been taken care of." I stood 2 feet behind him, watching. I had my own envelope in my bag. The kind you receive when you formally request an itemized billing statement directly from the hospital's patient accounts office. The kind with a total balance still outstanding of $94,200. Daniel didn't know I had it. He wouldn't know for another 4 months. But when he found out, in a room full of people who had spent those same 4 months singing his name like a hymn, who had built a quiet monument to his sacrifice and his goodness, everything he had constructed came apart in a single evening. Not because I screamed. Not because I accused. Because the truth was sitting in a folder on a table, and all I had to do was open it. This is that story. And I need you to understand something before I take you all the way back to the beginning. I didn't set out to destroy my brother. I set out to protect my father. Those two things only became the same thing because Daniel made them that way. If you're watching this and something about that already feels familiar, a family member taking credit they didn't earn, a sacrifice that turned out to be theater, hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one. To understand what happened in that hospital lobby, and everything that came after it, I have to take you back 18 months. To the February night my father collapsed in his kitchen and the 2 very different people his children revealed themselves to be in the hours that followed. My father, Robert, is 68 years old. He spent 31 years as a high school shop teacher in a small district in central Ohio. He is the kind of man who fixes things, lamps, bicycles, neighbors' screen doors, things nobody asked him to look at but that he noticed needed attention. He raised Daniel and me on his own after our mother left when I was 9 and Daniel was 12. He worked summers doing home renovation to cover what a teacher's salary couldn't. He never complained about money in front of us. He never made us feel the weight of what he was carrying. He just carried it. When he retired 4 years ago, he had a modest savings account, a paid-off house, and a pension that covered his basic expenses with about $600 left over each month. He was not a wealthy man. But he was a careful one. He had a supplemental health insurance plan he had maintained for 12 years because, as he told me when I tried to get him to drop it to save money, something always costs more than you think it will, Miriam. That's just the nature of things. He was right about that. He was right about most things. The night he collapsed, I was 3 hours away in Pittsburgh, where I'd been living for 6 years working as a compliance officer for a regional pharmaceutical firm. I got the call from his neighbor, Mr. Pacheco, at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Mr. Pacheco had seen the kitchen light still on at 10:30 the previous night and had come over to check. He found my father on the linoleum floor near the refrigerator, conscious but unable to get up, gray in the face, his left arm numb from shoulder to wrist. He had been there for approximately 4 hours. 4 hours on a kitchen floor, alone, too stubborn or too frightened to reach for his phone. That detail has never left me. I think about it more than I probably should. I drove through the night. I arrived at Granger Regional Medical Center at 1:15 in the morning to find my father in the cardiac care unit, stabilized but serious, attached to more monitors than I had ever seen on one person. A nurse named Patricia briefed me with the kind of efficient compassion that only comes from doing the hardest part of a job for a very long time. He had experienced a significant cardiac event. There was arterial blockage. He would need a procedure. The recovery would take weeks, not days. There would be follow-up care, medication management, possible additional intervention depending on how he responded. I sat in a chair beside his bed and held his hand while he slept. I didn't cry until I was in the parking garage at 4 in the morning, and then I sat in my car and cried until I was empty. Daniel arrived the next morning at 10:15. He had driven from Columbus, which is 90 minutes from Granger. He had, by his own later account, learned about our father's collapse from Mr. Pacheco's text message at 11:30 the previous night. He had not called the hospital. He had not called me. He had, apparently, gone to sleep and driven over in the morning after he had breakfast and packed a bag. I noticed that. I filed it away without saying anything, the way you do when you love someone and you don't yet want to know what the thing you've noticed means. When Daniel walked into that hospital room, he became someone else entirely. He became the devoted son. He held Dad's hand. He made jokes. He talked to the nurses with easy familiarity, learning their names, remembering details about their shifts. He positioned himself as the one running point, fielding calls from aunts and uncles, posting careful updates to the family group text, coordinating with the discharge team about what home modifications our father would need after he was released. He was wonderful at it. I want to be honest about that. He was charming and capable, and he made our father light up in a way that made my chest ache with something I still can't fully name. I went back to Pittsburgh after 5 days because I had a project deadline I couldn't push and because Daniel told me, confidently, "I've got it covered here, Miriam. Go. I'll call you every day." He did call. Every day for the first week, every other day after that, then every few days. The calls got shorter. The updates got vaguer. But our father sounded okay, and the medical team was monitoring him closely, and I told myself that Daniel was handling it because Daniel had said he was handling it. The billing conversation happened on a Sunday in March, 5 weeks after Dad had been admitted. I was on a video call with my father, who was still in the hospital recovering from the arterial procedure he'd had 8 days earlier. He looked tired but better. More color in his face. He was complaining about the food, which I took as a good sign. Toward the end of the call, he said something that lodged itself immediately in the back of my mind and refused to leave. "I'm not worrying about the money end of things," he said. "Daniel told me he worked it out with the insurance and the rest is handled." I asked what that meant, exactly. Dad waved a hand. He said not to worry about it. He said he took care of it. There was something in his voice when he said it. Not quite certainty. More like the peace of a man who has decided to trust a version of events because the alternative is too exhausting to consider. I let it go in the moment. I told him I was glad. I told him to eat his terrible hospital food and rest. We hung up, and I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time before I opened my laptop. Our father's supplemental insurance had a coverage ceiling for cardiac events. I knew that because I was the one who had helped him select the plan 4 years earlier. The ceiling was $45,000. A cardiac hospitalization of the severity and duration he was experiencing, the procedure, the ICU time, the follow-up care, the medication, would run well beyond that. I knew this not because I'm a medical billing expert, but because compliance work means you read the fine print on things other people prefer not to think about. It is, professionally speaking, what I do. I submitted a formal written request to Granger Regional's Patient Accounts Office the following Monday, citing my status as my father's secondary contact and power of attorney, a document he had signed when I helped him organize his affairs 3 years prior. The itemized statement arrived in my email 4 business days later. Total charges, $138,400. Insurance applied, $44,200. Balance remaining, $94,200. There was no record of any additional payment. No personal check. No wire transfer. No payment arrangement established by a family member. The account was sitting open, accruing administrative fees, with a collections referral flag that would trigger in 60 days. I read the statement 3 times. Then I printed it, put it in a manila envelope, and drove to Granger the following weekend. I did not tell Daniel I was coming. I have thought about that choice many times since. Whether it was calculated. Whether I was already building a case. The honest answer is that I wasn't thinking strategically. I was thinking about my father on a kitchen floor for 4 hours, about the tired peace in his voice when he said Daniel had taken care of it, about what it would mean for a 68-year-old man on a teacher's pension to have a $94,000 medical debt referred to collections without knowing it existed. I needed to understand what had happened before I said anything to anyone. When I arrived at the hospital that Saturday, I didn't go straight to my father's room. I went to the patient accounts office, where a woman named Gail spent 20 minutes with me going through the account record line by line. No payment had been received beyond the insurance disbursement. No arrangement had been established. No family member had contacted the billing office at any point. When I asked whether anyone named Daniel Calloway had ever called or visited regarding the account, Gail checked the contact log and shook her head. Not once. I thanked her. I took a copy of the contact log along with the billing statement. I put them both in the envelope. I went upstairs to see my father. He was in better spirits that day. The physical therapist had had him walking the corridor that morning. He was talking about going home, about getting back to his workshop in the garage, about a rocking chair he'd been building for Mr. Pacheco's new granddaughter before all of this had interrupted him. I sat with him for 3 hours. We talked about nothing heavy. We watched half of a college basketball game on the small television mounted to the wall. When I left, I kissed his forehead and told him I'd be back the following weekend. In the parking lot, I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring, easy and relaxed. Hey, did you visit Dad today? Good timing, he just had PT. I stood beside my car in the cold March air and I asked, as evenly as I could manage, Daniel, can you tell me about the situation with Dad's medical bills? A pause. Not long. Half a second, maybe. But I felt it the way you feel a misstep in the dark. Oh, I'm working it out, he said. There's a payment arrangement with the hospital. I told him to let me handle it. He doesn't need to worry about it. And the money for that arrangement, I asked. Where's that coming from? He didn't hesitate. He had an answer prepared, or something close enough to one. I pulled from savings, he said. It's not a big deal. Dad would do the same for me. I looked at the envelope on the passenger seat of my car. The contact log with no record of Daniel's name. The balance still open at $94,200. I thought about what kind of man prepares a confident, generous-sounding answer to a question about money he has never touched. I said okay. I said thank you for handling it. I said I'd talk to him soon. I drove home to Pittsburgh with the envelope on the passenger seat, and I didn't say another word to my brother about the hospital bill for 4 months. That silence was the hardest thing I have ever done. Not because I'm patient by nature, I am not, but because I understood, even then, that what I said next and how and when I said it would determine whether my father ever had to know what kind of son Daniel actually was. And there was still a part of me, a stubborn, hopeful part, that was waiting to be proven wrong. I spent those 4 months doing what I do professionally, gathering information, building a timeline, making sure I understood the full shape of something before I committed to a conclusion. Daniel's finances, I learned, were not what the family believed them to be. He had cultivated, over the course of a decade, an image of comfortable success. He worked in sales management for a mid-sized manufacturing company, a job that paid well in good years. He drove a leased BMW. He had a house in a suburb of Columbus that he had purchased at the peak of the market in 2021. What the family did not know, what I pieced together through a combination of public records and one very illuminating conversation with our cousin Terrence, who had lent Daniel $8,000 18 months earlier and never been repaid, was that Daniel was significantly overextended. The house was worth less than what he owed on it. The lease on the BMW was 2 months behind. He had a personal loan from a credit union in Columbus that was in deferment. He was not a man with savings to draw down for a $94,000 hospital bill. He was a man who was barely managing his own obligations while successfully projecting the image of someone who had none. And yet, our aunts called him the family hero. Our Uncle Raymond sent him a card. I saw it on the nightstand in my father's room in April, that said, "What you did for your father is something a man can be proud of for the rest of his life." Our father looked at Daniel with something in his eyes that I can only describe as peace. The peace of a man who believes he has raised someone capable of showing up when it matters most. That look is the thing I keep coming back to when I ask myself whether I should have stayed quiet. Whether I should have figured out another way to cover the balance without ever letting my father know. Whether destroying Daniel's reputation was worth what it cost all of us. And every time I come back to the same answer. My father deserved to know what was real. He had spent 31 years teaching other people's children to take responsibility for their work. He had raised 2 kids alone on a teacher's salary without asking anyone for anything. He had been lying in a hospital bed for weeks, reassured by a fiction, grateful for a sacrifice that had never been made, carrying the quiet relief of a man who believed his son had stepped up, while the actual bill was sitting unpaid in a billing queue, 60 days from collections. He deserved the truth. And Daniel had made certain that someone was going to have to tell it. The occasion presented itself in June. My father had been home for 8 weeks by then, recovering steadily, cleared by his cardiologist for light activity, back in his workshop 3 afternoons a week. Our Aunt Carol, his younger sister, was hosting a family gathering at her home in Granger to celebrate his recovery. Dinner for 22 people. A cake. Toasts. The whole construction. Our Uncle Raymond had specifically requested that Daniel be given time to say a few words about what he had done for the family during the crisis, and Carol had agreed, and Daniel had, I knew from the family group text, accepted with the particular modesty of someone who has been practicing their acceptance speech in the mirror. I RSVP'd yes. I drove down on a Friday and stayed with my father that night. We had dinner together, just the 2 of us, at the kitchen table where he had spent 4 hours on the floor in February. He had repainted the cabinets while he was recovering. He showed me the work with the same quiet pride he brought to everything he built with his hands. It was good work. Careful and even and exactly right. I helped him with the dishes. I watched him move around the kitchen with something lighter in him than I had seen in years. He was not worrying about money. He believed that had been handled. I thought about telling him right then, in that kitchen, gently and privately, before the party, before 22 people and a cake and my uncle's prepared toast. I decided against it. Not to protect Daniel. To protect my father from having to perform composure at a dinner in his honor while absorbing information that would gut him. If it was going to come out, and it was going to come out, it needed to come out once, completely, in a room where the full shape of it could be seen by everyone who had been made to believe something that wasn't true. I went to bed that night with the envelope in my bag and my hands completely steady. The dinner was the following evening. Aunt Carol's house is a wide ranch-style home on a cul-de-sac that she has spent 30 years making look like a magazine spread. She is my father's youngest sister, a retired school librarian with strong opinions about flower arrangements and an almost spiritual commitment to the idea that family occasions should be beautiful. She had done the table in cream and sage. There were centerpieces. There was a hand-lettered sign near the entryway that read, "Welcome home, Robert." The whole house smelled like pot roast and something baking in the oven, and when I walked in with my father just after 6 o'clock, the room filled with the particular warmth of people who are genuinely glad to see someone still standing. My father moved through it all with the careful, grateful energy of a man who understands, in a way he maybe hadn't before, that none of this is guaranteed. He hugged people slowly. He asked about grandchildren by name. He stood at the kitchen counter with Uncle Raymond for 20 minutes talking about absolutely nothing, and the ease of it, the ordinary bliss of 2 old friends who almost lost the chance to have the conversation, made my throat tighten. Daniel arrived 20 minutes after us. He came through the front door carrying 2 bottles of good wine and a bouquet of flowers for Carol, and the room shifted toward him the way rooms tend to shift toward people who have learned, over a lifetime, exactly how to enter one. He was wearing a sport coat. His hair was neat. He was smiling the smile of a man who has earned his place at the table and knows it. He hugged our father first and longest. I watched my father's face over Daniel's shoulder. That piece again. that settling. It made me feel something complicated that I have never been able to reduce to a single word. Daniel found me near the kitchen doorway. "Hey, you made it." He said it warmly, genuinely, and for a moment I saw the version of him I had grown up with, the older brother who taught me to ride a bike in the church parking lot, who sat with me through 2 nights of food poisoning when I was 14 because our father was working a renovation job 3 hours away and there was nobody else. That person was real. Whatever had happened to him since, that person had existed. I want to be accurate about that. I told him I wouldn't have missed it. I smiled. I went to help Carol carry things from the kitchen to the table. We ate. The pot roast was everything the smell had promised. There was bread and salad and 3 kinds of dessert because Carol believes firmly that one dessert at a family gathering is a form of pessimism. The conversation moved the way good dinner conversation does, from subject to subject without agenda, landing occasionally on something real before bouncing back to the comfortable surface. My father told the story about Mr. Pacheco finding him on the kitchen floor, and he told it with humor now, with the particular freedom of a man who has survived the thing he's describing. The room laughed. Raymond refilled glasses. Somewhere around the middle of the meal, around the point when the first wave of fullness settles and people start to lean back slightly and breathe, I excused myself from the table. I went to the guest bedroom where I had left my bag. I took the envelope out. I set it on the bed beside me and I sat quietly for approximately 2 minutes. I was not nervous, exactly. It was more like standing at the edge of something with a clear view of both sides and understanding, fully, that there is no version of stepping forward that doesn't change everything. I put the envelope in the inside pocket of my blazer. I went back to the table. If you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you know that the moment before the moment is often the hardest part. Not the confrontation itself, not the aftermath, but that last stretch of ordinary time when you're sitting in a room full of people you love, holding something that is about to rewrite the story they all believe. If you're watching right now and something about that resonates, if you've ever sat at a family table carrying a truth nobody else in the room knew yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support is what makes it possible for me to keep bringing you these stories. It genuinely means everything. Dessert was being cleared when Raymond stood up. He had the natural authority of a man who has been the oldest person in every room he's entered for the last 15 years, and when he rose and lifted his glass, the table quieted without being asked. "I want to say a few words," he said. "I'm not going to make a speech." He paused for the laugh he knew was coming, because Raymond always made a speech. The laugh came. He smiled. He said that watching his brother-in-law come through what he had come through was a reminder of what mattered. He talked about Robert the way people talk about someone they have known long enough to see clearly, with the particular tenderness of long familiarity, all the sharp edges softened by time and shared history. He raised his glass to my father. And then he turned to Daniel. He said that in difficult moments, family shows you who it is. He said that Daniel had stepped up in a way that a father could be proud of and a family could be grateful for. He said that taking care of the financial end of things, handling the pressure of all of that so that Robert didn't have to worry, was the kind of thing you didn't forget. He said it simply and without exaggeration, and every person at that table was nodding, and my father was looking at Daniel with those eyes, that settled, trusting peace, and Daniel received it all with a bowed head and a small, modest smile. Raymond said, to Daniel. The table said it back. To Daniel. Glasses touched. My father reached across and put his hand on my brother's forearm, and Daniel covered it with his own hand, and the two of them stayed like that for a moment while the room murmured its approval. I let it finish. I let the toast complete itself. I let the warmth settle back over the table. I have thought about this since and I believe it was the right call, not out of cruelty, not to let Daniel sit in unearned praise a moment longer than necessary, but because what I was about to do required that the room be fully present. That everyone had heard, clearly and completely, what had just been said. I set down my glass. I said, quietly but carrying, I want to add something, if that's okay. The table looked at me. Carol nodded. Raymond sat back down. I said, Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need to tell it to you here, in front of everyone, because the people at this table were part of believing something that I want to make sure they also have the chance to understand correctly. My father's expression shifted. Not alarm, not yet. More like the careful attention of a man who trusts his daughter but recognizes the particular weight in her voice. Daniel said my name. Miriam. The word had a shape to it, a warning compressed into 2 syllables. I looked at him. I kept my voice level. I said, I'm going to need you to let me finish. I reached into the inside pocket of my blazer and I placed the envelope on the table. I didn't open it yet. I just set it there. I said, 6 weeks after Dad was admitted to Granger Regional, I submitted a formal written request to the hospital's patient accounts office. I cited my power of attorney. I asked for the full itemized billing statement and the account contact log. I said it the way I would present findings in a compliance review, clearly, without editorial, following the facts in order. I heard Carol set down her fork. I said, Dad's total charges came to $138,400. His supplemental insurance covered $44,200. That left an outstanding balance of $94,200. I opened the envelope. I placed the billing statement on the table where my father and Raymond, sitting closest to me, could read it. I said, I also requested the account contact log. This is the record of every phone call and every in-person visit made to the billing office regarding this account. I placed the contact log beside the statement. I said, there is no record of Daniel ever contacting the billing office. Not by phone. Not in person. Not by written correspondence. The account has no payment arrangement on file. As of the date I pulled this statement, the balance of $94,200 was unpaid and had been flagged for collections referral. The table was absolutely still. The kind of still that has weight and texture to it. I could hear the refrigerator running in the kitchen. My father said nothing. He picked up the billing statement. He held it in both hands and read it with the slow, deliberate attention of a man who has spent a lifetime making sure he understood the thing in front of him before he responded to it. Daniel said, it's more complicated than that. There's a payment arrangement, it wasn't processed through the main billing office, it's being handled through a separate, his voice lost its shape as he said it. The words arrived without the architecture they needed. I said, I spoke with Gail in patient accounts. She oversees all payment arrangements for that facility. There is no separate channel. There is one billing office and one contact log. Raymond said, quietly, Daniel. Just his name. Nothing else. Daniel looked at our father. Whatever expression he had prepared for this evening, the modest grace, the gentle deflection of praise, it was gone. What was underneath it was something I had not seen on my brother's face in 30 years. Something unmoored. Dad, he said. I was going to handle it. I am going to handle it. I just needed more time. I've had some financial pressure and I thought I could get ahead of it before anyone had to know. My father set the billing statement down on the table. He set it down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady and you don't want anyone to see that. He looked at my brother for a long time without speaking. Then he said, in a voice so quiet the table leaned toward it, you let me believe you had taken care of it. Daniel said, Dad, my father said, I told your uncle. I told Carol. I told people you had handled it so I wouldn't have to worry. He paused. While I was in that hospital room, I stopped worrying about the money because I believed you. The table was still. Marlene, our cousin, Carol's daughter, had her hand pressed over her mouth. Raymond was looking at the tablecloth. Carol stood at the edge of the room with a dish towel in her hands and her face doing something difficult. Daniel said, I know. I know what I did. I'm sorry, Dad. I panicked. I didn't know how to tell you I couldn't do it and I I let it go too long, and by the time I thought about fixing it I'd already told everyone and I didn't know how to walk it back. There it was. Not a grand villain's confession. Not cruelty for its own sake. Just a man who had borrowed an identity he couldn't afford and run out of runway. That almost made it worse. It would have been easier, in some ways, if he had done it out of malice. Instead, he had done it out of vanity, and cowardice, and the specific desperation of someone who needed to be seen as the son who stepped up more than he needed to actually step up. I said one thing. I said it quietly and I said it once and then I stopped speaking. I said, the account goes to collections in 11 days. The room processed that. All of it. The timeline, the number, the shape of what had almost happened to a 68-year-old man on a teacher's pension while his son accepted toasts in his honor. I watched it move across people's faces, the recalibration, the retroactive anger, the grief of having believed something that wasn't true. My father picked up the billing statement again. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Daniel with an expression I will carry with me for the rest of my life. There was no rage in it. There was something much harder than rage. There was the particular devastation of a man who has spent a lifetime trying to raise someone with a spine and is only now understanding that the lesson didn't take the way he'd believed. He said, quietly and finally, I need some air. He pushed back his chair. He walked through Carol's living room and out the front door and stood on the porch in the June evening. Nobody followed him. The room understood, without being told, that he needed a minute to be somewhere the story wasn't. Carol put the dish towel on the counter and went to stand in the kitchen doorway. Raymond looked at Daniel with the expression of a man who has run out of language for what he is feeling. Daniel sat at the table with both hands flat on the cloth, staring at the billing statement as if he could change what was on it through sustained attention. I excused myself. I went outside. My father was sitting on Carol's porch swing, the one that faces the cul-de-sac and the oak tree that has been growing in her front yard since before either of us can remember. His hands were on his knees. The evening was warm. Somewhere 2 houses down, a sprinkler was running. He did not look up when I came out, but he moved slightly on the swing, making room. I sat beside him. We were quiet for a while. The swing moved slightly in the way porch swings do when you're not pushing them, just responding to the small shifts of breathing. He said, finally, how long have you known? 4 months, I said. He nodded slowly. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I needed to understand the full picture before I said anything, I said. And because I didn't want you to spend your recovery worrying about it. He was quiet again. Then he said, what's the right number? To settle it. I said, $94,200. But Dad, he said, I have savings. Not all of it, but enough to start a payment arrangement. The pension covers the rest if I stretch it. I said, I know. I already called the billing office. I spoke to Gail last Monday. I told her we'd be in contact before the end of the week. There's a 6-month payment arrangement available at no additional interest if we initiate it within the next 11 days. I've been holding the number in case you needed it. He turned and looked at me then. Really looked at me, the way he used to when I was small and had done something that surprised him. He said, you had this ready. I said, I didn't want you to have to scramble. He looked back at the oak tree. He said, very quietly, thank you, Miriam. We sat on the swing for a long time. The sprinkler shut off. The light shifted to the long, golden kind that only happens in June just before the sun goes down all the way. A neighbor walked a dog past the end of the driveway and raised a hand in greeting that my father returned without quite seeing. After a while he said, what am I supposed to do with him? It wasn't really a question. It was the sound a man makes when he is looking at something true and painful and understanding that there is no instruction manual for it. I didn't try to answer it. I just stayed beside him on the swing while the evening settled around us and the light went slow and amber and finally soft. Inside, I could hear the murmur of the room reorganizing itself around what had just happened. That is what families do. They reorganize. They find the new shape of a thing and they learn to sit inside it. Some of them do, anyway. Some of them walk to their cars and drive away and don't come back. I already knew which one Daniel would do. He knocked on the porch screen 20 minutes later. My father looked at him. Daniel said, "Dad, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to figure out a way to cover it." My father said, "There's nothing to figure out, Daniel. Miriam already handled the arrangement." Daniel looked at me. Something crossed his face, gratitude and humiliation in equal measure, indistinguishable from each other. He said, "I'll pay you back." I said, "You'll pay Dad back. Every cent. We'll put it in writing." He nodded. He didn't argue. Whatever version of himself had stood in that hospital lobby 8 months ago with a manila envelope and a borrowed confidence, that version understood it was finished. My father said, "Go home, Daniel. We'll talk." Daniel left. We heard his car pull out of the cul-de-sac. My father and I went back inside to where Carol had made fresh coffee and nobody was quite sure where to put their eyes. Raymond shook my father's hand and held it for a moment with both of his. Nobody said anything about the toast. The cake sat on the counter in its box, untouched, because nobody had quite recovered enough for cake, but Carol cut it eventually and put pieces on plates because Carol believes that you finish what you started, and she is usually right about that. The evening unwound the way evenings do after something real has moved through them, slowly, carefully, with a kind of tenderness that wasn't there before. My father sat at the kitchen table with Raymond and talked, and whatever they said to each other I don't know, because I stayed in the living room with Carol and let them have it. I drove my father home at 10:15. We didn't talk much on the way. When I pulled into his driveway, he sat for a moment with his hand on the door handle, looking at the front of his house the way a man looks at something he almost lost. He said, "Your mother used to say that the truth always costs less than the lie." He paused. I never quite believed her. He got out of the car. He stood in the driveway and looked back through the window at me. She was right, though. He went inside. I waited until the kitchen light came on before I pulled out of the driveway. The fallout, when it came, arrived in layers. The first layer was fast. The first layer was fast. By the following morning, Raymond had called 2 of my father's brothers, and the version of Daniel that existed in the family's collective imagination, the devoted son, the one who stepped up, was gone. Not dramatically. There was no group announcement, no public reckoning. It happened the way reputations actually collapse in families, quietly and completely, through a series of phone calls where someone tells someone else what they saw, and the story travels until it has reached everyone who matters and there is nothing left to defend. Daniel called me 3 days after the dinner. His voice had lost the easy warmth I had grown up hearing in it. He sounded flattened. Like a man who has been standing in one place for 72 hours without sleeping. He said he wanted to understand why I hadn't come to him first. Why I hadn't given him a chance to fix it privately before I said anything at the table. I told him the truth. I said, "Because you had 4 months, Daniel. I gave you 4 months of not saying anything, hoping I was wrong about what the billing statement meant. I said, you used those 4 months to let Dad keep believing something that wasn't true. You used them to accept a toast. I said, if I had come to you privately, you would have made me a promise and I would have spent the next 4 months waiting for you to keep it and watching Dad believe a lie for even longer." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You could have trusted me." I said, "You gave me the billing statement, Daniel. You gave me the contact log. I didn't choose not to trust you. You showed me I couldn't." He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with. He said he was sorry. I believed him, in the way I believe most people when they apologize after being caught, not that the apology is insincere, but that the sincerity arrives only after the alternative has been removed. I told him the payment arrangement with Granger Regional had been initiated. My father had put $22,000 toward the balance from his savings and established a monthly payment schedule for the remaining $72,200. The arrangement was interest-free for 6 months and then carried a modest administrative rate after that. It was manageable on his pension, barely, if he tightened elsewhere. I told Daniel that we had drafted a simple written agreement, my father, Daniel, and I, with a family friend who happened to be a notary, outlining that Daniel would reimburse our father in full at a rate of $1,200 per month beginning in September. Daniel said, "Miriam, I don't know if I can do $1,200 a month right now." His financial situation, I know. I said, I know. We set it at $1,200 because that's what the math requires. I said, figure it out. Sell the car. Find a second income. Do what Dad did for 31 years when things were tight. You figure it out. He was quiet again. Then he said, very quietly, he knew about my finances, didn't he? Your father always knew more than he let on about both of us. He just chose to believe the version of you that you presented because he wanted it to be true. Daniel didn't say anything. But I heard his breath change. That particular catch that happens right before a grown man starts to cry and catches himself. I let the silence sit. I didn't fill it. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do for someone is not rescue them from the feeling they've earned. We hung up a few minutes later. I sat in my apartment in Pittsburgh with my phone on the coffee table and I thought about the brother who taught me to ride a bike in a church parking lot. I thought about the version of him that had really existed. I grieved it, quietly and privately, in the way you grieve a thing that didn't die recently but that you're only now allowing yourself to bury. The repayment held. Not perfectly, not without friction. There were 2 months in the first year when Daniel came in short and had to make up the difference the following month. There was one phone call between him and my father in February that I wasn't part of and don't know the full contents of, but that my father described afterward only as necessary. Daniel made his payments. Slowly, with difficulty, and without the ease of a man for whom $1,200 a month is a small thing, he made them. That is the honest version of what happened, and I want to give it to him accurately because accuracy is what this whole story has been about. What changed in the family was harder to quantify than a payment schedule. Raymond, who had given that toast, never quite looked at Daniel the same way. Not with open contempt, but with the particular careful distance of a man who has learned to adjust his trust and doesn't intend to adjust it back without sufficient evidence. Carol sent Daniel a card at Christmas that year. She always sends cards. But she didn't invite him to host anything, and she didn't ask him to speak at anything, and those 2 absences said everything that the card didn't. Our cousin Terence, who had lent Daniel the $8,000 that had never been repaid, called me in August to ask whether he should expect to see it. I told him honestly that I didn't know Daniel's full financial picture but that I would mention it. I did mention it. Daniel paid Terence back $500 a month for 16 months. It wasn't fast but it was real, and Terence, who is a fair man, acknowledged that. The thing nobody tells you about being the person who tells the truth in a family situation like this is that there is a period, longer than you'd expect, where you feel worse, not better. The vindication that looks clean from the outside is considerably messier from the inside. I spent several months after the dinner wondering whether I had handled it correctly. Whether the table full of people had been necessary. Whether I could have protected my father and spared my brother's humiliation simultaneously. I kept coming back to the same place. My father had been sitting in a hospital bed believing a lie while the bill that lie was supposed to cover sat open in a collections queue. That was not a situation that could have been resolved with a quiet conversation that nobody else witnessed. It needed to be seen by the people who had been made to believe it, because the people who had been made to believe it were the same people who would have continued praising Daniel for something he hadn't done. The truth needed the same audience the lie had gotten. I still believe that. I have made peace with believing it. My father called me on a Sunday in October, 4 months after the dinner. He called in the late morning, which was unusual. He was typically a late afternoon caller, after he'd been in the workshop and cleaned up and had his second cup of coffee. When I answered, he sounded lighter than I had heard him since before the collapse. He said he'd finished Mr. Pacheco's rocking chair. He said it had turned out well. He said Mr. Pacheco's granddaughter had sat in it for the first time that morning and had immediately fallen asleep, and Mr. Pacheco had cried a little, and my father had pretended not to notice so that Mr. Pacheco could preserve his dignity, which was the correct and decent thing to do. He talked for about 20 minutes about nothing in particular. The workshop, the weather, a new router bit he'd ordered, a documentary he'd watched about the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge that he thought I would find interesting. At the end of the call, just before we hung up, he said, "I want you to know something." I said, "What's that?" He said, "I've been thinking about how you handled all of it. The billing office, the 4 months, the way you made sure the payment arrangement was ready before you said anything at the table." He paused. "You didn't just tell the truth. You came prepared. You made sure that when the truth came out, there was already a path through it." I said, "I didn't want you to be left holding a problem without a solution." He said, "That's what I mean." He was quiet for a moment. "That's what I mean, Miriam." We said goodbye. I sat with my phone in my lap for a long time after, in my apartment in Pittsburgh on an ordinary October Sunday, and I let myself feel the full weight of what he had said. Not as victory. Not as vindication. Just as the particular, irreplaceable thing it was, my father seeing me clearly and saying so. My father completed his payment arrangement with Granger Regional in full, ahead of schedule, in 14 months. He sent me the confirmation letter in the mail, which is how my father communicates anything he considers official. He had written one line across the top in his careful block handwriting, "Handled." I put it on my refrigerator and it has been there since. Daniel's last payment to my father was made this past spring. My father called to tell me when it arrived. He didn't editorialize. He just said, "The last check came." I said, "Good." He said, "I know." We moved on. Daniel and my father are in contact. It is not the relationship it was, and I think both of them understand it will not return to that shape. There is a version of their relationship that was built on my father believing a particular story about his son, and that version is gone. What is being built in its place is something more truthful, more cautious, and in some ways more honest than what came before. Whether that is better or worse I genuinely cannot say. I think my father would tell you it is different, and that different does not have to mean lesser, but that it takes more effort. Daniel and I speak occasionally. There is no warmth between us right now, but there is no active wound either. What there is, mostly, is the careful, slightly formal cordiality of two people who share a history and have recently had to revise a significant portion of it. I think we will find our way to something better than that eventually. I don't know how long it will take and I have stopped trying to predict it. What I know is this: I drive down to Granger every 6 weeks. I have dinner with my father on Friday night and spend Saturday morning in his workshop, handing him tools I can't name while he explains what they're for. I am not a particularly handy person and he finds this both baffling and endearing, which I think suits us. He has started a new project, a storage bench for the front entryway of his house, the kind that has a hinged lid and a cushioned top. He drew the plans himself in pencil on graph paper and taped them to the wall above the workbench the way he has always done, and standing in that garage looking at his handwriting on graph paper, I felt something settle inside me that has not been fully settled in a very long time. He is 68 years old. He lives alone in a house he has paid for, in a town where people know his name, making things with his hands for people he loves. He is careful with money and generous with time, and he tells the truth even when it costs him something. He raised 2 children on his own after their mother left, and one of them turned out fine, and the other one is still working on it, and he has not given up on either of them. He is not a wealthy man. But he is a careful one. He was right about that being the nature of things. Something always costs more than you think it will: the lie, the silence, the borrowed identity, the story you tell a room full of people about a sacrifice you haven't made. It always costs more than you think it will. And someone always receives the bill. I am glad I was the one who opened the envelope. I am glad I was the one who asked Gail for the contact log and drove to Granger and sat on Carol's porch swing with my father in the June evening and stayed beside him while the light went slow and amber and finally soft. I would do all of it again. Every quiet month of it, every difficult conversation, every moment of sitting with something hard and refusing to put it down until it had been handled the right way. Because my father sat in that hospital room and stopped worrying about the money because he believed someone had handled it. And somebody should have. Not for the toast, not for the story it would make, not for the way it would look in a room full of people with raised glasses. Just because he is a man who spent his life handling things for other people, and he deserved to have someone do that for him once without being asked. He deserved that completely and without condition, and I am so glad he got it, even if it arrived later than it should have and from the direction he didn't expect. That is the thing I keep, when I sort through everything this past year and a half has cost me and given me. Not the vindication, not the payment schedule, not the look on Daniel's face at Carol's dinner table. Just my father, on that porch swing, in the June evening light, making room. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If this story moved you, please check out the other videos on your screen right now. I think you'll find something in them that stays with you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. It means more than I can say. I'll see you in the next story.